school fundraising in DC. We'll talk a little bit about what relationship mapping is, how to map your relationships, and then what do you actually do when you get these relationships mapped? And then obviously plenty of time for questions and answers. I anticipate we'll probably have like 15, 20 minutes at the end to answer any of your questions. But again, feel free to throw them in the chat, either through Zoom or Whova as you see fit or as they come up. So what I'd love for everybody to do, and I know it's early, but I'd love for everybody just to throw in the chat their name, their school, their role, and maybe one thing that you're looking to get out of the session, or maybe where's your fundraising currently, or what are you hoping to gain? So if you just want to take a minute or so to throw that in the chat, that would be great. And I know that's a lot to type, so I'll give you a second or so. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce my work. Looks like we have Bernita Thompson from Roots. She's a principal. Great, well, welcome. I don't think we've met before, so I'm excited to see new faces and new names. So while you're typing, I'm going to do some introductions, or just an introduction of myself quickly. So again, my name is John Campbell. I'm a certified fundraising executive and the founder and CEO of Funded Strategies. I have come from the charter school space, so I was the head of fundraising and strategy for Eagle Academy Public Charter School for several years, and left about 2 years ago to launch Funded Strategies. And over the last 2 years, I have worked with a number of charter schools, not only in DC, but also across the country, including charter support organizations like the DC Charter School Alliance. In fact, I'm working closely with this particular conference and have supported the Data Summit and conferences in the past, the Public Charter School Board, and then worked with schools in Atlanta, most specifically Ethos Classical, which we'll use as an example throughout this session. So that's a little bit about me. Been doing fundraising specifically for 12, 15 years now, and in the charter school space for just about 5 years. So it looks like we have a couple of people putting in their introductions. Looks like we have Monique, sorry, can't read this morning. Monique from E.L. Haynes, Monisha from Inspired Teaching, Claire from KIP, and Wendy from Early Childhood, and Sarah from Washington U Ying. And we got Marla Lawson from DC Prep. And so that's great. And I know we have a couple of others on the line, and we're excited to have you. Before we get started, I do want to point out one thing. The reason we scheduled this for 9 a.m. on Friday is not only because there was an open slot available, but it's because I have been, over the past couple of years, coordinating and leading a community of practice of charter school fundraisers and communications professionals that meet together since the pandemic bi-weekly. Previously, it was monthly, and this is our normal bi-weekly slot. We do 9:30 to 10:30. And so for those of you who are not part of that group, it's got a Google group and a way to communicate with one another, and then also to share best practices. Definitely let me know, reach out afterwards. I'll shoot you a quick email to see if you want to be added to that list. We'd love to have you. It's kind of informal way to talk about OSCE grants, talk about funders, best practices, maybe think through some problems, or even just to kind of commiserate with one another about some of the challenges that we face as charter school fundraisers. This was started when I was at Eagle, and now we do it as a group, and we have anywhere from 3 people attend to 15, 20 people. So definitely let me know if you're interested in that. We'd love to have you as part of our community of practice, and I will share more information about that at the end and then after the session. It also looks like we have a couple of others joining and sharing their information. Joanne Smith from Roots. We have Rachel from Kingsman, Tara from Carlos Rosario. So thank you again for joining us. All right, so the fundraising landscape, and this is going to be the fundraising landscape specifically to DC charter schools. So I think this is some data that you might not have seen before, and this is based on survey responses that we pulled together from actual charter school leaders here in DC. So last year we surveyed many of you participating on this webinar, other development leaders here in DC. And really the question that we were trying to answer is, where does your philanthropic support come from? We obviously know that between 90 and 97% of charter school dollars come from per pupil funding. So that we don't necessarily account in these equations. When we look at the other percentages of where that discretionary funding comes from, what we see is that it shouldn't be a surprise. Obviously, a majority of that, 38%, comes from competitive government grants. So these would be like the facilities grant. Some schools include academic quality, even though that's formula based, 21st century, those types of things that come through OSSI or come through the DME or federal government and are competitive in nature. When we look at actually what the purpose of this conversation is really for, we see that schools here in DC attract 26% of their philanthropic support from foundations, and then another 16% from individuals. And we also broke out in this graphic, and you can get the full graphic on my website at fundedstrategies.com, but there, how that individual philanthropic support breaks out, whether it's through major gifts, board giving, parent giving, which I've written extensively about. How do we actually increase parent support through fundraising, even if you are a Title I school, and what that means for race equity, and how do we have an equitable conversation about that? So definitely happy to have that conversation. But essentially, individuals, all of those stakeholders account for 16%, and foundations account for 26%. Events and corporate account for a little bit less, but they are still present. At the end of the day, in order for us to identify these individuals or make stronger relationships with foundations and funders, we really need to understand who's in our network and how do we best leverage that network. And so this is really where relationship mapping comes in. So I think the question, obviously, that we should be asking is, what is relationship mapping? And I'm going to show you a very simple example of what relationship mapping is. And I'm not sure if you can see all of the details, but this is a basic school that I put together, and we will actually go into a live relationship map later on. But essentially, relationship mapping is a way to visualize your school and stakeholders, known and also unknown networks. And when I mean unknown networks, what I'm really talking about is, we know that your board members, your stakeholders, your parents, your head of school, you have people that you know personally, and you also have people that you probably don't even know that you're connected to, because they're connected through somebody else or through another organization. And so through the relationship mapping process, our goal is to uncover those known networks, which are usually easier, and then identify unknown networks. We really use this as a tool to collect information, and we'll talk a little bit about more what that means. And then the map here and the maps that you'll see later are used to draw connections to potential funders and individuals who might have an interest in supporting your school. You can use relationship maps to also map funders to your organization. So let's say you're trying to reach out to the K-Fritz Foundation. I think probably almost everybody on the call has either applied or has heard of the K-Fritz Foundation. And you really know that you need a connection to Toby at the foundation. We can back into this relationship and see if we have any connections to Toby, because we've identified the funder. And I know that is a lot, and we could talk about how to do that later on in the session. And the whole point is to identify any connections that we might have to people who could support our work, or who people we know will support our work, but we don't know how to get to them. So why should you do relationship mapping? It's really simple. I think the question that I get asked by charter school leaders more than not is, great, we want to grow fundraising, we want to generate more support. We just don't know where to go, and we don't know who to go to. And that's because we oftentimes don't have natural stakeholders. For private schools, they can go to their families very easily and generate major gifts. For traditional public schools, there is the DC Public Ed Fund. We have a little bit more of a challenge, and that certainly there are some institutional funders that support charters like Walton, Charter School Growth Fund, New Schools Ventures Fund, and some others. But at the end of the day, it is often challenging to identify individual donors, and it's even more challenging to identify individual donors that might expand beyond our family base if you are doing any fundraising from your family. So the point of the relationship map is to identify relationships using your stakeholders that you would not normally have gone to, and that can become ambassadors of your work and also can support this work financially. The next question I think is, when do we do this? You can really do this anytime, but what I like to recommend is that we do this at least in the beginning, at least when new board members join your board. That's always a great opportunity. We're collecting that data. We're able to build out the map, on a one-on-one basis, or you could do this at the beginning of each board term or school year. That's a great opportunity if you haven't done this before, which I know a lot of schools haven't, to start collecting that data from your board members, from your stakeholders, and to build it out so that way you can build your plan for the rest of the school year. And so there is no right or wrong time to do this. The point is that you should start to build out your relationships and think strategically about how do you map them, whether you do it in the robust way that we're going to talk about here, or whether we do it in some simpler ways that I'll point out along the way. I want to make sure there aren't any questions that I'm missing here, so forgive me. All right, so we'll continue on. So I think obviously the real question is, now that we've figured out what relationship mapping is, how do we actually map our relationships? So we're going to go through 4 steps here, and I'll dig a little bit deeper into them. All right, so the 4 steps to mapping your relationships are collect, analyze, research, and visualize. These all relate to data. And this isn't necessarily academic data that you're all used to. This is really qualitative data that we collect. And I'll actually have some tools that you can use to collect this data. So first off, you want to collect the data. You want to analyze that data, and we'll talk about what that means. You want to do some thorough research, and we have some tools that you can use, both free and paid, but the free ones are just as good. And then we'll talk about what does it mean to actually visualize that data, and how can you use the visual data map to end up leveraging it and activating your network. So let's start off with collecting data. I think collecting data is probably the most critical piece. And while we understand who our board members or our stakeholders are, we don't ask the right questions often. And one of my experience, personal experience, is being both serving on a charter school board and having worked for a charter school. Too often we go to our board members and ask, who do you know? Most of them shrug their shoulders and say, I don't really know anyone. And by posing specific questions to them, like the questions that we have laid out here in a simple format, we're really able to flip that question on its head. We don't necessarily want to know who do you know. We want to know a little bit more about you, because when we know more about you, we can actually build that relationship map out for them. And this is true whether you have a philanthropic board or a community-based board of parents. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, everybody has a network, and their networks look differently. And so I do want to call that out specifically. I think oftentimes the pushback that I hear is that, I have my board is all parents. My board is a community-based board. And that's how your board should be, right? I mean, we want to be representative of our community, and we want to make sure that our boards are responsive. We can still map relationships from those networks. And so I strongly encourage you to continue to ask these questions to identify opportunities. We know that our board members have numerous relationships within their personal and professional networks, but they often just don't know who to approach or even how. And so we want to make both of those things as simple as possible. So we suggest that you provide an overview of the importance of kind of relationship mapping to your board, what the goals of it are. Our goal is to identify new donors. Our goal is to get more cheerleaders for our school. We need more advocates. We need people to know about, Washington U Yang or Early Childhood Academy. We need people in our community to be advocates. And then remember that we're not collecting this data simply to ask people for money. And I think that that's sometimes hard for people to realize, especially board members. Board members often say, I don't really feel comfortable sharing these names because I'm afraid that you're just going to ask them for money over and over and over again. And that's not the goal. The goal is to build genuine relationships, build these networks out to build genuine relationships with members within their network. If it's a good fit, great. We will go ahead and start to cultivate that relationship. If it's not a good fit, that's okay. We will let them go, because at the end of the day, we only want people within the network that are going to be supportive of your work, and we don't want to pester people who are giving just to appease somebody. That's not the point. And so I talked a lot about like board members, and you can do this process for board members. You could also do this process for really any stakeholder within your organization. That could be teachers, it could be parents, it could be heads of school, other major donors. It really doesn't matter. The process is the process. And it allows for you to identify stakeholders who you think might be able to be beneficial to your work. So how do we actually collect this data outside of just asking all of these questions? Certainly, you can go through and have qualitative conversations with every single one of your board members, or excuse me, every single one of your stakeholders that you're looking to engage. That's a lot of time. And I know that there are some heads of school on the call. I know that there are some development leaders. And I think time, especially in schools, is limited. I remember my capacity was stretched very thin when I was at Eagle Academy. And that's because we were involved in everything. Development leaders often wear multiple hats. And so qualitative interviews, while might be great, they might not be the best way to actually collect this data in a timely fashion. And so what I've done is I've actually developed a relationship mapping data collection tool. This is just a screenshot of one question from it. And I will share this with you in the chat. And I'll share this out also via email. But this is essentially a way to ask all of those questions on the previous slide and some more in a way that allows board members to directly fill this out on a fillable PDF. You can do this in a Google form. I can send you the Word document. You can edit this. You can really do whatever it is you want with this form to collect the data, because that's the data that you will use to then analyze and do additional research. So I'm gonna move on to analyze here. So now that we've collected the data, we have some basic understanding of, okay, this is where I'm gonna use some basic names. This is where John Smith, he's a board member of ours. He worked for DC government, but before that, he worked for, I'm gonna throw out a name here. He worked for the trash company. And these are really simple, basic examples, but we now have this data. He also happens to volunteer at on the Chamber of Commerce board. Okay, great. So now we have a little bit more information. What we didn't get is that there are some gaps sometimes in the data that was provided. And so the thing that I always suggest in this analyze phase is to review the data that you got and see if there are any known gaps. And what I mean by known gaps is a little bit more about this board member, or your head of school might know about this board member. So ask for some more context, start to fill in some of the gaps. And if you can't do that because of the information that you have is incomplete, go back to the board member and ask them some additional follow-up questions, because some areas were left blank. What we're trying to find out is, in that data, what are some of the affiliations that you have? What are your hobbies? Where did you previously work? Where do you currently work? Where did you go to school? Those types of questions, if they're left blank, either there isn't any data, and that's fine. But what we need to know is if there is blank data, or empty data, we need to go back and see if we can try to fill in some of those gaps. This is not necessarily the most important step, but it does help to paint a fuller picture of what is happening and the data that you're collecting from your board members that you will then use to build out your network map. And so, I think you can obviously ask questions of your board members if there are gaps. I know you're retired. I see this often. Somebody that's retired on the relationship map of their current profession. Great. I'm very happy for you that you're retired. I'm wondering, where did you work previously? Because I didn't see anything here. And obviously, if you're retired, there's a conversation that we can have. I saw that you were on this nonprofit board. Did you know Jennifer during your term? Because it looks like she served there. I think we updated this tool to include city and some other information related to the individuals that they can list on here, because we need to make sure that we're getting the full context. So you'll see how this plays out when we get to the actual map, but it's digging in a little bit deeper on the initial data screen. So once we get all of the data, the next question is, what do we actually do with that data? And this is where I'm going to list some tools, and then I have some examples and some questions here and things to look for when you're doing it. So I begin every search using Google. It's free, it's easy, and it's robust, and it's broad, right? I think that's the point. We want to kind of cast a wide net to figure out who we're actually trying to find. So let's say you're a board member, and actually have a very specific example in 2 slides. List a couple of names on their data collection tool, people that they'd like to introduce to your school. I'm going to start looking at those people to figure out who they are and who do they know, because now we have a direct connection to those people, and we have a second degree connection to all of the people that they know. So we start by using Google. What I'll do is I'll type in the name and maybe the city where they live. This is a little less relevant for DC since we all live in DC, but it does help you to narrow down that search. If I'm looking for John Smith, which is an awful name to Google, but John Smith, Washington, D.C., probably gonna get a lot of results. So now I'm gonna need some other data points. I know that John Smith worked for waste management, so I'm gonna pull in waste management and I'll start to see some results. What you're looking for is really a series of additional data points. Sometimes you'll find them, sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll need to use other tools like iWave is a great wealth research tool. If I can't find somebody in Google, I'll definitely use iWave. LinkedIn Sales Navigator, if you haven't used this is a paid tool. But the great thing is that if you are connected, you can connect board members to your LinkedIn Sales Navigator account, and you can start to see who they're connected to within their networks. So that way they can make easier introductions. And we all know some of us have significantly robust LinkedIn pages that we may or may not know everybody directly, but at the end of the day, it's a conversation starter. And then if you're not familiar with Foundation Directory Online, there are free services out of there, but there are also paid, both more expensive and slightly less expensive options that help you to really dig into foundations and who those funders are. I know that we have a couple of grant writers and grant managers on the call, so I'm sure that they're very well familiar with Foundation Directory Online and how to use it. It is a tool that I use to identify institutional funders when I do a big prospect research project for schools. So this is definitely an area where you can use these tools, and there's so many other tools. This is just an example of the tools that I use. So things that we're looking for when we're actually going through the process. We're looking for, articles naming the person that we're Googling or we're looking up for their volunteer work, any donations that they've made, boards of service that they serve on, colleagues, partners, or companies that they've been involved in, other board positions, I think is important. And what I mean by that is, do they serve on other community boards? Do they serve on another charter school board? Do they serve on, a community-based organization? Unique interests or additional information, any connections to funders. If we can identify that this person previously worked for a funder or serves on a funder board, that's your golden ticket to a great conversation. And then what I like to do is explore other board members. And so let's say you're looking up, I'm going to use this John Smith example again, that you're looking up John Smith, he's a board member of yours, and he has indicated that he serves on the Chamber of Commerce board. Great. We're going to go and look at that Chamber of Commerce board, and we're going to start to add them to our map because now they are second degree connections to the school. Those are connections that we would have never thought about, but now we know that John has a connection to them, and he may or may not be able to make introductions or may not feel comfortable. And we'll talk about that in a second, but he at least has some sort of direct connection to those individuals. So we'll add them. And then what we'll do, and if we want to take this out a step even further, is we will look at all of those people on that board and start to see, are they on other boards? Are they connected to other funders? And so we'll repeat the process over and over again until we feel like we've gotten to a point where we have good data or we've exhausted all of the options that we can for that particular person. So I know that this research is honestly the most time-consuming piece. This is something that I do a lot of for my clients and for the schools that I work with. It's a challenge, and I know I talked a lot about capacity. So there are opportunities where you might be able to use interns or student workers or things like that, especially in this current climate where this can all be done remotely. This might be an opportunity to engage different stakeholders in a way that's going to be cost-effective and time-effective. So here's a very specific example. This is a real example of a school that I worked with in Atlanta. So Elena, who you see here in the middle, and this is actually an example, a very small example of the relationship map we'll look at in a minute, but this is Elena. She's a board member of Ethos Classical down here on the right, which is a public charter school in Atlanta. And they are a brand new public charter school. They are in their second year. And as part of that, they wanted to start to build out relationships and identify potential funders. So we did a data collection tool. We did this relationship mapping project with them. And through that process, Elena had indicated that she was connected. She listed these things. She was on the Atlanta Symphony Advisory Council. She is a board member at the Harvard Diversity Project. She's on the Junior League of Atlanta. She also listed these names: Rodney Bullard and Milton Little. None of these things, I don't know anything about these people until I do the research, because one, I'm not in Atlanta, and two, that's not my background. So what I did is I started to build out this relationship map. And so I know it's a little hard possibly to see on the Zoom, but each of these little bubbles is something that she listed in her network map. If I were to take this one step out further, which we did do in the map, and I will show you, we would start to see who these people are connected to. So the example that I'm going to show is that Elena mentioned that she listed Rodney Bullard as somebody that she would like to introduce to the school on her network map. On that data collection tool, she said, Rodney Bullard is somebody I'd like to introduce to the school. Turns out Rodney is the head of the foundation for the Chick-fil-A Foundation, and is extremely connected in the Atlanta philanthropic scene. He's on the Atlantic History Council. He's on a bunch of other boards. And so that is an amazing opportunity that not every school's going to have, but really opened up a lot of doors. What that ended up doing is that not only got us an invitation, Ethos to get an invitation to apply for a Chick-fil-A grant for upwards of $350,000, of which they are a finalist as we speak, it also allowed for them to be introduced to one of the largest education funders in Atlanta, the Campbell Foundation, who has expressed an interest in supporting their work, simply because we found out that Rodney was connected to the head of an heir of the foundation, essentially somebody who's running the foundation. We did that research. We told Rodney, hey, we see that you're connected to this person. Would you mind making an introduction? And he said, absolutely. And at the end of the day, that got us a conversation with one of the largest funders. I know that this is an extreme example and that not every school is going to have these examples, but I do think that there is at least one or two examples like this within your school that can open up doors and open up possibilities that you may not know exist. Elena knew Rodney was connected. She didn't know how connected and what that actually would result in. And now that's resulted in a significant amount of support for Ethos Classical. And I'll dig into that map and how we got there, but I think this is a really great micro example of this map. So after we've done the research, we've collected the data, analyzed, done the research, I encourage schools to visualize their maps, right? It's one thing to put a bunch of names together. It's another thing to actually visualize it and to figure out how people are connected. And so I have two examples. One is the fake example, the sample example that I put out earlier. Another is a real example, which I will go live into to show you how it works, and a free tool that you can use. But what I find is that when we visualize the network, this is a great opportunity to report back out to your board. Oftentimes when we engage board members, we collect a lot of information or we ask them to do a lot of things, and then we never report back out. I like to report this map back out because then they get really excited. And for those board members who may have had maps or data collection tools that were not as filled out, now their wheels are spinning about how do we actually build this out? How do I build my network out? Because I can see Elena's network is extensive and she just listed her fraternity on it, or sorority, sorry, on it. How do I do that? Oh, I can add these things. So that's one reason we report out. The other is also to activate our networks, which is the last piece that we'll talk about today. But this is an example. So this school, ABC Charter School, is a made up school, obviously. And it's hard to see, but essentially I created two fictional board members, Barack Obama, because I miss him, and Donald Duck, because why not? And so we took that and then built out connections. So we know that Barack is married to Michelle and that they're part of the Obama Foundation. We know Donald Duck is married to Daisy Duck, who works at Disney. She runs something at the Disney Foundation. This is a made up situation, obviously. And what we do know is that this particular funder, Colleen, serves on the Obama Foundation board and the Disney Foundation board. So now we have two possible connections to Colleen that we didn't know that we even had a connection to Colleen until we started to build this out. This ends up being a larger funder who could support this work. This is a really, 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 really simple example. This is not how your network map is probably going to look or even work, but I wanted to at least provide some really simple, goofy, no pun intended, answer. How it really will look is like this. This is Ethos Classical's actual network map. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into their map. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for 1 second. Give me one. Make sure I have the right screen up. So we're going to share this network map. Here. All right. So this is actually Ethos Classical's map. This is complicated. We're actually still adding to this week. We've been adding some second tier funders to this list, but essentially each of these dots is a particular connection to an organization or an individual. We built this out from these larger bubbles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I think, 9 board members filling out a very simple data collection tool. From that, we built this entire map out and we're able to identify funders and donors. The great thing is, this goes back to the question of who do you know? Board members, again, don't always know who they know. And when they're asked to say, hey, can you invite people to a particular event or a particular function or graduation, they just don't know who to go to. They go to their same people. This gives them a list of people to go to. It also gives us an opportunity to start to map out these relationships. So I'm actually going to go in to this, and you can search through this. This is not a live map for the group to use, but I do want to give you an example. So here's Ethos Classical. We're going to go out one step. What you see here are a bunch of, these are all of their board members. Also one particular funder, which is Redefine Ed, essentially our Ed Forward. It's the same organization, just in Atlanta. Here's all their board members. When we take this one step further out, we start to see who their board members are connected to. And this is how we started to build out the map. So I'm going to go back to Elena. And get back in here. So I'm going to go back to Elena. This is the map that we saw earlier, where you can see that she's connected to Rodney Bullard. Verizon, she's done some contract work for. She's connected to Milton Little, who ends up being the head of the United Way in Atlanta. She's on these boards. And we're going to take this one step further out. She's got a really robust network. So she's connected, obviously, to all the board members. This is her connection to the Atlanta Symphony Advisory Council. So what we did here is she only listed that she's on the Atlanta Symphony Advisory Council. Great. I went through and found all of those advisory council members and added them here to the network map. Because what we then did is looked at all of these people to see if they were connected to any of the funders that we were trying to reach, or if they were funders themselves. Elena's also connected and a past board member of the Junior League. So we put all of the board members that we were aware of during her tenure and to see if they were connected. I'm going to pull up. Here's her connection to Rodney Bullard. They're friends. Rodney, again, is at Chick-fil-A. And just going to see what these are here, is on the board of the Atlanta History Center. And then each of these, has a little bit more information. Rodney, who's here, is connected to John Stevenson Jr., who runs, it's not listed here, but he runs the Campbell Foundation, which is, again, another large funding prospect. So you start to build this out and take it multiple degrees. So all Elena did was list the Atlanta Symphony Advisory Council, Rodney Bullard, and a couple of others, the Harvard Diversity Project. And we started to build this out and identify some prospective funders that we didn't know existed within our network. I'm going to go back to the presentation. All right, so that's how the tool look. That's how the visualization can look. There is a free tool. It's called kumu.io, kumu.io. I actually think Kazir Hussein actually from Two Rivers mentioned that in one of the communities of practice gatherings, and I have used it ever since. So thank you, Kazir. I really appreciate it. It's a great tool. It's free. There is a paid version. If you want to make the map private, you can pay for it. But at the end of the day, it is a free tool. It's great to use and it's simple. So we now have a network map. We've identified relationships. We've kind of tried to figure out some new donors. What do we do with this map? And so there are 4 examples here. Excuse me, just needed some tea. So these are just some examples of how you can activate your network. I normally suggest that you design kind of an entry point event, whether that's a tour. I've seen some really great distance learning tours in this world that we're kind of in. I have seen schools do some mission-driven events. So at Ethos, for an example, we developed what we call classical conversations. The school's name is Ethos Classical. We do classical conversations, and through that, the board members are encouraged to invite a handful of their members to the classical conversation, and it's a way to do a school tour and in a non-threatening way. The point's not to ask for money. The point is to identify people who might be interested in having a continuation conversation. Also asking board members to make strategic introductions. If we've identified some people that they're connected to in their network map that are strategic to the organization, this is a great way for them to activate their network. And I actually have included some template language that they can use, even if that connection is distant. So even if it's not, oh, I know John Smith personally, it could be, I know John Smith and John Smith knows, Mary. If that's the case, there's some template language in the slide deck that you can use with board members to get to Mary. That's your goal. If Mary is on the board of a foundation, your goal is to get to Mary, even though you don't know her directly. I already mentioned, inviting people to mission-related events, but think about it. Invite potential donors, current donors, prospects to mission-related events, both digitally and virtually and in person. We can still do this in the distance learning world. And I know that schools are still trying to figure out what they're doing. And that's probably going to continue to ebb and flow over the next couple of months. But think about graduation or fundraising galas or distance learning tours, science fairs, mentorship opportunities. Think about all of those things that you're probably already doing that you can invite community leaders to in a strategic way to get them to know and learn about your school. And then finally, I mentioned that there's some template language here, but provide board members with template language to reach out to their networks. Board members have less time than school leaders, and I know that's sometimes hard for us to imagine, but you're not their only responsibility. Oftentimes they're full-time jobs, they're full-time parents and full-time jobs. They serve on other boards. Getting their attention is really challenging. And so let's make it as easy as possible. Provide them with as much template language as you can and direct steps. And so that's the tools that I have included in here as well. So that way they can reach out to their networks. Again, the goal isn't to ask for money, but instead we want to start building relationships with the map. We want to strengthen relationships. We want to build new relationships within those networks. So I'm not going to run through the specific language, but here is an invitation to a mission-driven event for somebody who the board member knows. Essentially, it talks about the work, and it specifically calls out that you will not be asked for money. You can see that in the second paragraph. All we're asking is that you enjoy the experience, and then we'll follow up afterwards. So for those of you who are familiar with the Banavon model of fundraising, there's some pieces that we've borrowed from that, as in we don't ask for money and we want to follow up. The intentional follow-up is really critical. Similarly worded letter. This is how do you get an introduction to, or how do you make a connection to somebody who might not be in your first degree of connections? This is a board member. Actually, this is a very simple, we've changed some names and that's the extent of this, but this is an email that a board member had sent to somebody that they were connected to, trying to get to somebody that we needed to be connected to, that we thought that that person was connected to. So here's another example. You will get these in the slide deck materials. I know that we just went through a lot in a very little time, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I want to be here to answer any questions that you have for me, whether they're whether they're related to relationship mapping or fundraising in general. I'm here to answer your questions, and feel free to either put them in the chat, and I'm going to try to pull up the Whova chat. Forgive me, my second computer did not work. Or put them in the Zoom chat, or unmute yourself, whichever is preferred. And Preeti, I don't know, is there anything in the Whova chat?
Yes. Do you want me to read the questions out?
Yes, because I can't find my Whova right now, so thank you.
No worries here. I can do that. Give me 1 second. So we'll start. What are the core best practices for fundraising, and does it limit creativity?
Core best practices for fundraising, and does it limit creativity? I would say no. I find it's funny because I don't think that I'm a very creative person, but then when I talk to schools and clients, they're like, oh no, you can really think. I think the world, there are no limits in fundraising often. At the end of the day, to me, the most important thing in fundraising is relationship building. And I know that we talked a lot about relationship maps, and that wasn't the point of the response. But at the end of the day, it's about genuine relationships. I believe in transparent conversations with potential prospects. I believe in building meaningful relationships that are connected to your mission and connected to your work. I think when you're thinking creatively, sorry, there are some things that I probably wouldn't do that I think schools do, and they're fine. They're just not your highest and best use, and that's often what I'm looking for. So the big sales and the candy sales are fine, but that's not what's going to fill your gap, right? That's not going to fill the per pupil gap that we get compared to our traditional public school peers. That's not going to make sure that you have the resources that you need to run an out of school time program. That's not going to make sure that you have what you need. It's great. It might be good for like teacher supplies or things like that, and makes parents feel part of it. But what I would suggest is that you find alternative ways to engage donors. I've seen some really great examples, and I've written a lot about this on through my blog, so I'm happy to share those resources. But engaging families and staff. I know that there have sometimes where there's a competition between participation between families and staff. I believe a lot in participation goals. I think that's a best practice when you're talking about schools, because it is less so about the dollars raised and more so about engagement, and you can always cultivate those relationships for additional gifts after that. But I don't think it limits your creativity. I think honestly, at the end of the day, you can be super creative in fundraising, and honestly, the most successful fundraisers are the most creative, to find solutions that meets both the donors' needs, the school's needs, and filling the gap. So I think creatively, and I'm happy to think through any of those possibilities with you.
Great. And do you suggest screening potential donors, organizations, companies for ethical practices?
That's a great question. And yes. So when I typically go in to do a prospect research project, I will often ask the school or the organization that I work with, are there funders you want to stay away from, right? Schools typically stay away from, the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. We're not going to go to Remington or, Reynolds in North Carolina, who is tobacco. We're not going to go to those. Those are pretty easy. But then that gets a little bit more murky when you talk about Chick-fil-A. And this is a conversation that I had with my client. Will you take Chick-fil-A money? Because Chick-fil-A has notoriously been anti-LGBT. And as somebody who is LGBT, I had to have that conversation with my client. At the end of the day, the client decided, and that school decided that because they were Atlanta based, Chick-fil-A is based in Atlanta, we could use those dollars to do good versus what the company has. So that is a decision for your school. I definitely think you should evaluate these things. I know that my husband also works in fundraising, but works in the environmental space. That becomes really difficult, right? Do you take oil money? Do you take, especially if you work in oceans, do you take, fossil fuel money? Those are complicated questions, and it's not always cut and dry. And I have policies that I've written on this, and you can make policies to drive your school, but at the end of the day, you need to figure out what works for you.
So this is a follow-up question from me, but is it like, do you create like, okay, these are, with that client or whoever you're talking to, these are what we're willing to do? Like, how do you, like, is there like a protocol, or like, how do you think through
Yeah.
these murky ones?
So I often recommend that schools have a gift acceptance policy that defines what types of gifts you're willing to receive, and from whom you're willing to receive those gifts. That the gift acceptance policy is not black and white, right? It does have some black and white language, but at the end of the day, it is a guideline for you to be able to deny a gift, because it's easier for you to say, I'm sorry, we can't accept your gift because our policy doesn't allow for us to accept gifts from these particular funders, and funders generally understand that. Or it allows for you to be flexible. So let's say there is a funder that, like Chick-fil-A, I keep going back to that is complicated, and you're like, but this is a really great opportunity. Do we pursue it? At the end of the day, as a consultant, I can advise you. This has to be up to the school leader's decision and where their comfort level is. But I do suggest that you have a gift acceptance policy that really clearly defines the types of gifts that you're willing to take, and from whom you're willing to take them.
Yeah. And there were a couple questions that were posted before the event. I wasn't sure if you've already looked at those or answered those, but I'll just read them out to you.
Yeah.
What approach should be taken during this period of uncertainty when trying to cultivate new donors? And kind of a follow-up connection to that, are there certain types of donors, foundations, corporations, individuals who are more apt to support schools at this time?
Yeah, let's talk about the first one. I might need to think about the second one, but
That's
the first one definitely, and I wrote early on in the pandemic about how can schools, and I'll throw all of these links to the blogs and things into the Hua chat and send them out. But I strongly believe that we should continue to communicate with our donors and our fundraising audience, and that's whether they're prospective donors, that's whether they are existing donors. And I think the biggest thing that we see is that organizations who stop fundraising, flat out stop fundraising during crises, whether this is a hurricane or whether this is a natural disaster or this pandemic, they, at the end of the day, take them significant years to get back to where they were. And for many of you on the call, or many schools, you're starting, already at zero. You don't want to have to start again at zero, or you have a very small donor program, and it's going to be hard to rebuild that. We cannot make assumptions for our community. We can make assumptions for ourselves, and this is the thing that I'll talk about parents. This is the thing I'll talk about donors. When we say, I don't want to ask somebody right now because I feel uncomfortable, I just said it. You feel uncomfortable, but we are not allowing them the opportunity to continue to support your work. And I think you actually will be surprised. So when you think about cultivating new donors, especially if they're brand new to the organization, my suggestion to you is to start out by, inviting them on some distance learning conversations, having them pop in, reaching out, asking them how they're doing, right? This was super popular at the beginning of COVID. It's still as popular now. We're seeing less of it. Sending them a handwritten note. People at the end of the day want this like human connection, because we've been starved of it for 9 months, and there's a lot of communication happening right now through Tuesday because of the election. I know that at the end of the day, reaching out is super critical, and I know, I don't know if Mervaline's on the call from Academy of Hope, but they called all their donors, and they were able to get some really great information about what the donors wanted to support, what they didn't want to support, where they were, what was happening. Do those, have authentic, genuine conversations with new donors and prospective donors. If they're new donors, invite them to something to introduce them to the school. I cannot and Preeti, you would know because this is an alliance event, but we did we used to do the first Fridays, right?
Mhm.
And with Focus, those got pivoted to virtual the minute COVID happened,
Yeah.
and we were doing a couple for the first couple of weeks. I will tell you that our attendance more than doubled, in some
Yeah.
instances tripled, for those events, and people from everywhere were able to attend
Mhm.
and eager to see what you were doing in a virtual world, new donors included. So I encourage you to think about opportunities that will invite people into your world, wherever that world is, whether it's in person or virtual. Definitely, there are things that you can do.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. So I don't know if you want to quick like talk about are there certain types of donors, if you feel like you've already covered that.
No, I can definitely cover that. So right now we're seeing a shift in funders. I think schools, the education has always been at the top of the list when we think about funders. In fact, when we look at the national data, education receives more philanthropic support than any other topic other than religion, right?
Right.
Religion is number one, and we understand why that is. Education is number two. Yes, I always put a little asterisk and a caveat there that education includes higher ed, which is not K-12, which is not charters, but education is number one. And what we're seeing right now is that a lot of funders are showing up to support distance learning,
Right.
to bridge equity gaps. I think that there's a lot of opportunity here for schools in the race equity space, especially because a lot of our charter schools here in DC serve predominantly Black and Brown communities. And so are there practices that you're doing that are innovative? Are there practices that you're doing that are reaching a particular community that funders are interested in? Look at what corporations are doing. Candid, through the foundation directory, has an entire list of COVID response funders. I definitely recommend checking that out. You could see who's stepping up right now from an institutional perspective. From individuals, this may sound weird, and it's not for every school, but I would say there's probably a sect of your school that would work, but parents are also stepping up. I think parents see firsthand the world, the reality of distance learning. Some of that is good, and some of that is bad, right? And I think some of them are able to manage it and have the privilege to work from home. Others don't, but those that do have that privilege to work from home and have a little bit more flexibility are and have been shown to be willing to support other families. And we've seen this from schools here in DC, that parents have increased their gift or have made a larger gift to support other families within their school. So
Mhm.
I think that there are definitely opportunities there that you should think about. Any
Um,
other questions?
I think there's like one last one we could answer. Does anyone want to unmute themselves? You have the ability to ask a question if you just want to verbally ask it. If not, I can go back to the Whova app. Okay, I'll give another 10 seconds. All right. So going back to some of the funder connection questions, there's one about like political connections or opportunities. So as an example, a very controversial, polarizing political leader wants to visit your school or have some kind of activity there. Like, how do you kind of handle that?
I have a great example because I have a lot of experience with this. When I was at Eagle Academy, we had, it is not a privilege in my opinion, but we had the Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, visit our school. And I think when you think about polarizing political figures, that's probably the number one thing that comes up, especially when we think about education. We ended up taking that visit. It was really complicated. And I think that there are some things that you need to think about. From a staff perspective, it was challenging, right? None of the staff, and speaking broadly, supported this particular administration, and this was shortly after the election. So it was difficult from a cultural perspective. But what that did do is that opened up doors. We ended up having what we were able to meet one-on-one with the Secretary of Education, with just her and two of her deputies, the head of school, myself, and another individual, to talk about funding, both for the charter school program fund as well as other special education funds, that built a relationship that then we could call on when we had an issue with a federal grant, because Eagle did receive a number of federal grants. And so it's, I don't know if there's a right answer or not. I know that that particular visit was declined by another school, and that was right for them. If it were me making that decision, I probably would have also declined it. But at the end of the day, we were doing what was right for our school, in a way to generate funds for us to do the work that we needed to do for our students. I think that those are challenging conversations. And if you think about the impact, not only on fundraising, but you have to think about the impact on staff morale and culture. And I think that that's something that not everybody thinks about,
Yeah.
in that particular instance.
Great. That is all the time we have and all the questions I think we can answer today. Thank you all for joining us. Please, I put the link to the session eval in the Huva chat. I'm also going to put it in the Zoom chat. We would love to get your feedback on this session and gather some information.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. I will send out all the slides and make sure they're all uploaded to the Huva, as well as all of the tools and materials that I referenced. But if you go to fundedstrategies.com, you can see the blog and a bunch of different blog articles, as well as the tools that I mentioned there as well.